What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to today's video. In today's video, we'll be diving into kind of the meta that has settled in Arena post Crimson Vow launch. I mean, to be quite honest, not much has really changed with what the top meta decks are currently in Standard when it comes to Magic the Gathering. These decks are also the best of one decks that you will see most in the queue if you're playing through the rank queue. Sure, there are other decks that also make the queue, but we're going to go over the top 5 decks that have the most player pool playing them, as well as the highest overall win percentage of each of these decks. If you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just talk about it. So the first deck up on the list is a MonoWhiteWeenie kind of style deck that utilizes some of the Magecraft cards. Most of the cards in the deck are cheap, costing either 1 or 2 mana, overall making the deck pretty cheap to play. Most of the creatures are cheap in the sense that they don't cost a lot of mana to play, therefore you can possibly multi-spell a lot on a lot of your turns, especially even in the early game. The goal of this deck is to kind of hit your opponent as hard as possible, as quickly as possible. We are utilizing some key cards that kind of help amplify our creatures a little bit more to kind of overwhelm our opponent with the amount of damage coming in at a quick point. One of them being Luminarch Aspirant. It's been a staple card ever since its release in Zendikar Rising, with it being one of those things that puts a +1/+1 counter on one of our creatures at the beginning of our combat, as well as us utilizing it in Leonine Lightscribe. It's a card that utilizes the Magecraft ability that whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we get to put a +1/+1 on all our creatures until end of turn. Overall, even making our 1/1s that much stronger. The 2 points of damage here and there will eventually stack up to the point that your opponent's at like 8 life, and one good swing and boost from this will finish off your opponent nonetheless. Other than that, we are playing a balance of creatures and instances and sorceries to kind of amplify that Magecraft effect, as well as playing enough threats that are fairly cheap or also produce their own threats to kind of overwhelm our opponent that way with a lot of, small creatures that are just get very wide on our opponent and they can't block those creatures. The one drawback, I think, to the deck that makes it kind of tough, especially against other aggro decks, especially like, say, something like a MonoGreen, is our creatures aren't that big initially. A lot of the boosts and stuff that we get for our creatures come from pump spells or Magecraft effects like the Lightscribe's effect, so the creatures don't stay that tough, so it makes it hard to get through some of our green creatures if our opponent's playing that particular color. Another thing too, with like any aggro deck, board wipes are always a thing, so I would say if you're in a decent position and you think your opponent's playing a deck that could have some board wipes, I would say maybe get enough threats on the battlefield and kind of continue building up those threats while holding back just in case you feel like a board wipe may be coming. With that being said, the deck list is pretty straightforward. We are playing 4 copies of the Battlefield Raptor. Getting that flying for a strike is definitely pretty sweet. A lot of the creatures that are big threats in the meta currently are on the ground, so getting that creature in the air that can get in through for some free damage is always very good. Follow that up with Code Spell Cleric. It's a great cleric that's a 1 mana 1/1. If it was the second spell that we cast during the turn it was played, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and the creature itself has vigilance, so that means we can attack as well as block it because it doesn't have to attack, so that's definitely also pretty awesome. Then we have Guiding Voice, allowing us to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature at sorcery speed, as well as allowing us to learn. And we do play a learn board of 6 cards. You can add in a 7th card if you think that you want to add in maybe like the white card to kind of to say your opponent can't play a particular spell and or a particular creature can't block. Other than that, I mean, really, you're not really going to want to go into here other than for Expanded Anatomy. You're hopefully not going to have mana issues. The deck doesn't need a lot of mana on the battlefield. Maybe like 3 or 4 is fine. We don't play tons of land, so mana won't be the biggest issue here. But nonetheless, we're playing Environmental Science, Expanded Anatomy for the +1/+1 counters, giving the creature a Vigilance. Also counts as a sorcery, therefore, combining pretty well with our Leonine Lightscribe. And then we have Reduction and Annihilation in case there's some pesky creature out on the battlefield. Besides that, we have Guiding Voice. You can always learn, get rid of a land card maybe in your hand that you don't really need, and maybe try to find a spell or a creature in your deck by discarding and drawing a card from our deck is also a possibility there. Then we also have Homestead Courage, which is another great spell that came from Crimson Vow. It's a 1 mana sorcery spell that puts a +1/+1 card creature control, gains vigilance at end of turn, and then we can flash it back from the graveyard and do it all over again, allowing us to maybe even play it multiple times on the same turn or playing it on multiple turns in a row in case we feel like we're not playing a lot of spells. We can hold this back and then therefore play it on the following turn, maybe to get that second spell effect going again. Then we got Monk of the Open Hand, a 1 mana 1/1 with the ability of Fury of Blows that whenever we cast a second spell each turn, we get to put a +1/+1 on Monk of the Open Hand, making him bigger, making us more threatening. Play it on turn 1. Turn 2, we play maybe 2 1-drops or 2 1-casting spells. It's now a 2/2, possibly even a 3/3 or higher, depending on how many spells we play or if we boost it. Portable Hold to get rid of any of those pesky things in the early game, as it exiles target not only a permanent opponent controls the mana value 2 or less. If it's a token or maybe even some sort of permanent. We can always exile it to get it out of the way, to get our creatures in for that free point of damage. And being at 1 mana is definitely pretty decent there. It is one of those things that doesn't hit a lot of things, but it hits a lot of the things that your opponent may play in the early game. Usher of the Fallen's a great 1 mana 2/1 with the boast ability that we can tap 2 mana, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token, just making our board that much wider. Also pretty decent threat. Having 2 power for 1 mana is pretty awesome. Then in the drop slot, we have Clarion Spirit, a creature that benefits us from playing second spells. It creates a 1/1 white spirit creature token every time we cast a second spell during each turn. So it's one of those things that's going to allow us to get in the air with more creatures, as well as building up our board to get wide against our opponent. We also have Faithful Absence. It's a 2 mana destroy target creature or planeswalker. Its controller investigates, also to get us around some pesky creatures that may be gluing up the board, allowing us not to get in through for some decent points of damage. Though our opponent does get a clue token, allowing them to tap 2 and sacrifice it to draw a card. Leonine Lightscribe, we kind of went over. It benefits from all the sorceries we have in the deck. The goal here is to get us in a position. This will allow us to kind of make all our creatures that much more threatening, to get in for that extra points of damage, whatever our opponent can't block. So definitely good in that sense. Luminary Aspirant to pump any of our creatures, whether it be our flyers and or creatures on the ground, just that 1 more, or even itself, in case we need to get those extra points of damage. And then the 3-drop slot, we have Skyclave Apparition. It's a 3 mana 2/2, and it also allows us to exile target non-land permanent opponent controls with mana value 4 or less, and whenever it leaves the battlefield, they get a token equal to the converted mana cost of that particular non-land permanent that we chose. And then, like I said, the mana base is, we're not playing tons of lands, we're playing mostly cheap creatures and cheap spells, so we only have 17 planes and 1 of the Cave of the Frost Dragon, so only 18 lands in total. So most of the threats are in the main deck, with a little bit of the learn board in case we need to maybe get an expanded anatomy for that additional pressure, or maybe even if we want to, we can always get environmental sciences, or you can always just discard and draw a card with the learn ability as well. By, instead of clicking into your sideboard, you go to the hand button and then click hand, and then click a card in your hand. It will discard that card, and then you'll draw a card in response. But this is actually one of the more popular decks, actually breaking into the top 5. I haven't seen a ton of it, but it's another mono white deck that I think people kind of forget about, and it does pack a punch when you do play against your opponent. So it is a deck to look out for, especially if you're on a budget. It's actually a pretty decent, cheap deck to build and put together. The next deck up on the list is an iteration of this deck, and this is MonoBlack Control, or whatever you want to call it. But essentially, it is the deck that utilizes snow permanents to use cards like Save Blood on the Snow. Also utilizes our planeswalkers as Professor Onyx and Lolth Spider Queen, really to get through for those points of damage against our opponent, to kind of overwhelm them that way. The goal of the deck here is to kind of just put pressure on your opponent's early game and kind of just set up yourself for the late game to get your planeswalkers out, to get the creatures that the planeswalkers produce with the Lolth Spider Queen, as well as getting the Magecraft triggers every time we cast a spell against our opponent. We drain our opponent for 2 life, we gain 2 life. And then we have other things to kind of wipe the board besides Blood on the Snow, like Meathook Massacre is another great card here. And we play a lot of spot removal in that sense, so we're trying to ramp up into that late game against our opponent. But overall, the goal of the deck here is just to kind of control the board, so your opponent doesn't play a bunch of creatures out on us. The one thing I will say it does kind of struggle against, especially if our opponent can't. If our opponent does get there and we haven't kept enough pressure, is especially against the decks that just play too many threats that we just don't have enough to deal with. Or if our opponent does get in while we're tapped out with, like, say, the Epiphany deck, it is one of those things that maybe struggles to recuperate if we allow our opponent to take too many turns in a row. But nonetheless, the deck is pretty strong in that. Besides that, it does work it is a very strong deck against most of the aggro decks that are currently in the format, as a lot of the spells do go around instructability and things like that, like Meathook Massacre is -X, and Blood on the Snow is a great board removal spell, as it allows us to return something back from the graveyard to the battlefield based on the amount of snow mana that we do cast to play it. But nonetheless, the deck contains 4 copies of Duress, as there is some getting rid of some of the non-creature, non-land spells from our opponent's hand, making them discard that card. For 1 mana is pretty decent. You could always cut down the copies if you really feel like you're not playing against a lot of opponents who play a lot of spells. But with there being decks that have a lot of spells in their hands, is pretty decent to kind of get rid of the removals and or counter spells if that's what you're looking out for. 4 copies of Eye Twitch, allowing us to go to our learn board. In this deck, you can go get your your Mascot Expositions, your Pest Summonings, Containment Breaches, Necrotic Fumes, or Environmental Sciences in case you're missing some mana drops. Always good to get your land drops pretty much up until you get about 6 mana out on the battlefield. Then we have Shambling Gas allowing us to ramp up a little bit quicker. Us playing something like a, Professor Onyx or even a Lul Spider Queen a turn early is, can make or break a game, especially against those more aggressive aggro decks. And it does create a decent blocker because it does block 2/2s pretty well, because in those scenarios we can always give that creature -1/-1, and our opponent may not want to attack into it, allowing us to kind of kill their creature in the process. Then we play Deadly Dispute here as another card that helps us ramp. Also allows us to create a little bit of tempo so we can draw some cards, create a treasure token as well. Hunt for Specimens allows us to learn as well. It creates a 1/1 black pest token that works very well with Deadly Dispute. And the learn ability is pretty sweet as well. Gets Infernal Grasp as that little bit of spot removal that we have in the deck, destroying target creature. We lose 2 life. It's not the biggest of deals, especially if we kind of get the deck going. The 2 points of damage here, 2 points of damage there is, especially in the early game, to kind of make sure we don't take the larger points of damage, is always very good. Miko Massacre, I think, is like one of the better black removal spells currently in the format outside of Blood on the Snow, just because of the idea here that we can tap whatever we need to, give everything on the board -X/-X, everything that our opponent would control would die. We gain 1 life, and everything that would die on our side of the field from it would make our opponent lose a life. So it's definitely a good card in that sense. So it makes it very risky for our opponent to even attack in when they're low on life totals, especially if we have some trump blockers out on the battlefield, because each time one of our trump blockers dies, they're going to be taking a point of damage regardless. Then we have Skullport Merchant, allowing us to kind of sacrifice another creature or treasure and allowing us to draw a card, continuing that tempo. Also pretty solid blocker at a 1/4. It doesn't really kill too much, but it does absorb a lot of damage in that sense. Soul Shatter, 1 copy of, just to kind of maybe get rid of that pesky Goldspan Dragon, or kind of cards that making our opponent sacrifice their high converted mana cost creature or planeswalker is definitely pretty decent. It gets around those indestructibility cards that will give creatures indestructible, because that doesn't prevent them from sacrificing. Hagra Maulin's an interesting card here that you don't see a lot of, but a 1 copy of just in case. A lot of decks maybe not playing non-basic lands, or basic lands in general, is cheaper for 1 less for 3 mana, or you can play it as a land tapped on the flip side, or 4 mana removal spell to destroy target creature. Well, Spider Queen, can't say enough. It creates chump blockers with Menace and Reach, allowing us to be a little bit aggressive, because the Menace is pretty good. It gets around, if our opponent only has a single creature. Reach is also very good if they have any flyers. And every time one of our creatures would die, we could put a loyalty counter in Little Spider Queen. We can also pay 0 loyalty, and we can draw a card and lose a life. And if we get to the -8, we get an emblem that whenever our opponent is dealt combat damage by 1 or more creatures we control, if that player lost less than 8 life this turn, they lose life equal to the difference. So if they lost 2 life, they'll lose additional 6 life at the end of the turn, so definitely pretty sweet there. At the 6 drop slot, we have the 4 copies of Blood on the Snow, just another more so board removal. Great card against those aggro decks, because we destroy the board or even their planeswalkers. We get something back in return. They don't. So we get to destroy all creatures or destroy all planeswalkers. We get to choose one of those. We turn creature or planeswalker with converted mana cost less than X from our graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the amount of snow spent to cast. So if we get 5 or less, or even 6, we'll get a converted mana cost like a Professor Onyx, Little Spider Queen, or even some of our smaller creatures if that's really what we need, just to kind of get some sort of board presence. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward, playing 24 total lands, 19 of the Snow-Covered Swamps, 3 of the Faceless Havens, which having creature lands are very good in this format, especially against other control decks that will wipe the board, because these lands will get it for points of damage even after a board wipe. And then we have a couple copies of Field of Ruin, just as well to combat our opponent's creature lands. And we can combat if we think our opponent's not playing any basics, or by destroying their their particular mana color that maybe they lack, and making them search for their library to not replace that land, and then therefore being a mana behind. But overall, pretty decent deck. I know there's many different iterations. I know I've seen some that don't have this, some that don't have this, some that may have more copies of this but none of these. So I mean, it's one of those things that you may see this iteration, you may see other iterations. I'm gonna have links for this iteration down in the comments below. And I'm gonna get all my decks from AetherHub, from the meta thing. So it is one of those things, if you ever frequent there, you can always see other versions, or see other versions people are playing. And there's another look at our learn board. For the most part, we have 2 copies of Environmental Sciences, 1 copy of Necrotic Fumes, 2 copies of Containment Breach, 1 Pest Summon, and 1 Mascot Expedition. I think you can also maybe throw back 1 more Containment Breach, get an extra copy of Mascot Expedition, just because it's always good to have an additional copy, just in case you do get in those matches where maybe your opponent is playing some sort of counter spells or things like that. But nonetheless, this is the 4th most popular deck currently in the meta in MTG Arena, so it's definitely a deck worth playing, and it's also definitely a deck to be looking out for when you do play any sort of deck that is playing some sort of black mana. So this next deck up is kind of like the deck that I think a lot of people dread facing, as it is a very good deck. It is one of those decks, though, it is a little bit slower. It needs to control the early game. It needs to kind of, make sure it's hitting mana drops and continuing the tempo, keeping the board clean to prevent them from dying too quickly, and that is the Izzet Epiphany deck. Essentially, the deck, what we're doing here is playing Allrun's Epiphany. If we get the chance, we can also combine it with something like Galvanic Iteration, allowing us to cast, whenever we cast this and then cast the next instant or sorcery spell this turn, we get to copy that spell and choose new targets for the copy. If we copy Epiphany, then therefore we get 4 bird tokens, we get 2 extra turns, and therefore kind of hopefully take over the game in that sense. The other thing we are doing in this deck to kind of allow us to get to that point is also playing Hall of the Storm Giants. As you know, 4/4/1/1 birds isn't very threatening, but if we play this, get the extra turn, then attack with the Hall of Storm Giants, we're now attacking for 11 points of damage, and then the following turn they're usually pretty dead there. We can also combine it with something like Burn on Down the House, getting us some 1/1 Red Devil creature tokens that whenever they die, they deal 1 damage to any target, they gain haste on the turn, or we can deal 5 damage to each creature or planeswalker on the battlefield as well, depending on the situation. So kind of like a board wipe slash creature ramper. But nonetheless, the deck is pretty straightforward. What it's trying to do, trying to clean up the early game on the board. Also trying to dig a little bit deeper to try to get to the Allrun's Epiphanies to set that up for the win in that sense. We are playing 3 copies of Fate and Hope as a decent bounce spell to bounce something back to our opponent's hand, allowing us to scry if we bounce something back that was mana value 3 or less. Spikefield Hazard as a land, or even a spot removal if we want to make sure something dies and gets exiled instead of going to the graveyard if our opponent has some sort of way to get it back. We have Jawari Disruption is a great card, especially against decks that will tap out, especially in the early game, a 2-mana counter. In the most parts, in a lot of decks, unless our opponent's playing very small creatures, they're usually going to tap out in the first like 3 or 4 turns, because a lot of the spells do people want to play on curve and use all their mana. So our opponent tapping out will allow us to then tap this for 2 mana and counter that spell, because our opponent won't have that open mana to pay that additional 1. Burn Enhance is a pretty decent spell, as MonoGreen is also one of the top aggro decks currently in the format, and this is kind of one of those things that even, it's 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker, but if the permanent's green, deals 6 damage instead, so it hits a lot of things in green. It's one of those things you probably don't need to have if you feel like you're not facing a lot of green, and you can probably swap it out with another 2 mana, spot removal spell. I think there's one that I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but there's one I think it's 2 mana for 3 damage or 4 damage, so you possibly go there. Cinderclasm is great against the small token decks or small creature decks where it's a 2 mana, 1 damage to each creature. If it was kicked, it deals 2 damage instead, so for 3 mana, 2 damage across the board. Expressive Iteration allowing us to dig a little bit deeper to look for our epiphanies, look for maybe that particular spell we're looking for, another draw spell. If we're missing a land drop, we hopefully dig a land drop, and then we put 1 card back into our library that we may not need. So definitely a good card that is definitely, fits very well with this deck. Iteration just kind of copies whatever we need. We can either copy, an additional Unexpected Windfall, Burn Down the House, Epiphanies. Can't copy a Deluge. I know I did a video, on this a Dragon's deck, the Izzet Dragon's deck that had Deluge. You can't do a Deluge because it's based on the mana that you spent to cast it, and the copy would be casted for 0, so therefore you look at 0 cards and select 2 of the 0 cards to put into your hand. But nonetheless, a pretty decent card that definitely works very well with this style of deck. And you can flash it back, so you can cast it one way, maybe on 1 Epiphany, and if you have get another mana source, you can cast on another Epiphany and then take 4 additional turns. Shadow Skull Smashing as a good spot removal spell, as well as a land in case we really need that red mana source. Divide by 0, great. Another card like Fate and Hope, allowing us to return target spell or permanent with mana value 1 or greater to its owner's hand. So we can, it's a kind of like a delay. So if our opponent casts something, we can bounce it back instead of countering it. They do get the chance to play it again, but definitely a good card in that sense. And then allowing us to learn to maybe get something that we may need based on the matchup. Demon Bolt is another good card in the sense that we can foretell it for 2 mana and then cast it as a 1 mana Lightning Bolt in a sense at instant speed. Then we got Memory Deluge as another card that allows us to dig very deep into our deck. Initially it's 4 cards, and then the second time we cast it is going to be for 7. Unexpected Windfall. We have to discard a card. We get to draw 2 cards and create 2 treasure tokens. So a great ramp card if we're trying to if we're really close to casting an Epiphany and possibly a Galvanic Iteration combo. A great card to kind of help us get us there. And if you copy it with a Galvanic Iteration, you'll only have to discard 1 spell. You get 4 cards and 4 treasure tokens out of it. Burn Down the House, yet again, it's the board wipe of the Izzet deck. 5 damage across the board to each creature on Planeswalker if we choose that ability, or we get 3/1/1 Devils. Also, like I said, could copy it to do 10 damage across the board, or get 6 Devils. And then Epiphany to take all the turns and get all the birds to hopefully win the game that way. Most of the time, if you can get to this point and cast multiple Epiphanies and your opponent is tapped out in some sort of way, Your opponent usually hits the concede button immediately. Like I said, this is kind of one of those decks that not a lot of people like to play against, but it is a fun deck when you do get it going to really play and kind of get into the woodwork of how the deck really works. And then my base, like I said, is pretty straightforward. It's not playing any snow mana. We are playing 2 copies of the Hall of the Storm Giants, 7 islands, 7 mountains, 1 Frostbound Snarl. It's okay. You can get rid of the Frostbound Snarl, and I think get the blue-red dual land from the new set if that's the way you want to go. 4 pathways and 2 Field of Ruins to combat other decks to play creature lands. And like I said, here is the learn board. We got 3 copies of Environmental Sciences because land drops are important. We want to make sure we get to turn 6, turn 7 as quickly as possible. Teach-ins to kind of, fill our hand back up if our opponent has more cards than us. 1 Introduction of Prophecy and 1 Mascot Exhibition. Overall, great deck. Fun deck. It is a deck that makes a lot of people question if All Runs Epiphany should be banned. The funny thing is, I think the competitive scene, this deck kind of has fallen off a little bit, but yet again, I'm kind of recording this before this weekend where I think there's a few Magic events that are happening, so we'll kind of see if this deck makes a reappearance in the standard events that happen. But nonetheless, is definitely a deck you should be on the lookout for if you're playing against any Izzets. It's either this version or it's the Izzet Dragons version, so be on the lookout for. Most of the decks are kind of similar in some sense. The Dragons just has more dragons in, of course, but this is definitely a deck to be on the lookout for. This next deck up on the list is kind of a deck that's kind of been around and it's kind of been in its current form since the 2022 standard kind of released in Arena, and that is going to be MonoGreen Stompy. Not many cards have really gotten added to the deck since Crimson Vow. Most of the cards are pretty stocked, if you have the cards from before Crimson Vow. And Innistrad for the most part, not really too much of the newness is here, but it is a very strong deck and a very powerful deck. It plays, the reason why it's considered like a Stompy deck is because most of the creatures are very strong and they don't cost a lot of mana. So like you get a 3-drop for 4 with Trample. You have a 3/3 that gets bigger and bigger every time we play a land. A 3/3 for 2 mana that allows us, if we attack in with things, to draw a card. If we attack with total power 6 or greater, that we can also tap 4 mana, give it a 5/3 and trample, and it isn't a human to end a turn. But overall, it's a deck that just does very big things very, very early, and it just overwhelms your opponent with just overall power and size. Nonetheless, the deck is pretty straightforward. It does have a lot of decent synergies in that sense. We are playing snow mana and some snow permanents with Sculptor of the Winter here to kind of allow us to have a little bit of additional ramp at 2 mana. There are other versions that play like the 1 mana Sentinel as well, so I do think you may see versions that have that or versions that have this. I guess it's pick your poison, as this only taps itself, whereas the Sentinel has to tap another creature in order to do its ability. But we do play only snow mana, so that's definitely good to synergize with that. But in the 1-drop slot, we have Blizzard Ball, which is I think the strongest fight spell currently in the format, as it is a 1 mana fight spell at sorcery speed. If we control 3 or more snow permanents, the creature you control gets +1/+0 and indestructible, and then those creatures fight each other, so you can fight and swing in with that creature. The creature's not going to die unless your opponent makes you give it -X/-X or makes you sacrifice it, but overall very, very strong fight spell. Snakeskin Veil is another card here. It's a 1 mana instant speed. Allows us to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and also give it hexproof. So if our opponent's going to spot removal a creature, we can also play this in response, allowing us to get that additional +1/+1 counter and also give it a hexproof, nullifying the spell that may be casted on that particular creature. We have Outland Liberator, as it is kind of one of those cards to play against your mirror matchup. You can tap 1, sacrifice it, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and it is a werewolf, so it has the Daybound Nightbound cycle. The difference is the flip side allows it, whenever it attacks, it destroys target artifact or enchantment and defendant player control. So it's kind of one of those things that is kind of like that the gorilla from it's not Innistrad, it's can't think of the set off the top of my head, but it's the gorilla that was the 6-drop that every time it initially came into the battlefield, it would fight a creature, and then every time it would attack and destroy target artifact or enchantment. It's a cheaper version of that, and then it's built into the ability. You don't have to sacrifice it in order to do so. Ranger class is the next one. It is a 2 mana enchantment class that enters the battlefield. We get a 2/2 wolf creature token, so we're getting something for 2 mana. We can invest 2 mana into it till we get it to level 2. Whenever we attack with a creature, whenever we attack, we get a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature, so making 1 creature that we control that much bigger. And then for 4 mana, we can look at the top card of our library at any time and cast creature cards from the top of our library as if they were in our hand. So allow us to kind of regain tempo, especially if we don't have a lot of cards in our hand. Playing creatures off the top, creating more threats on the board is definitely very good there. Sculptor of the Winter is a 2 mana 2/2. Like I said, you tap it to untap target snowland. The weird thing is the game doesn't recognize it as being like a way to kind of ramp, so you actually have to tap the land, use this ability to untap the land to then cast a possible 4-drop spell or some spell that if you don't have the mana, it's not going to auto pay it to do it. It's kind of weird interaction, but if you're trying to cast a 4 mana spell, only have 3 lands out, you may have to just tap the land out, float the mana, untap it with this, untap that land, and then play the spell. And then you have Werewolf Pack Leader. Like I said, it's a 3/3 that for 2, which is very strong in itself. And then whenever it attacks, if we're attacked with creatures with total power 6 or greater this turn, we get to draw a card. So great card that allows us to get a little bit of tempo in that sense. If you have 2 of these out, you draw a card for each of them. So definitely awesome there. Kazu Mammoth is one of those ones that I feel like, I feel like I've seen it in versions. I haven't seen it in versions. I feel like it kind of comes and goes depending on how everything is going. But it is a 3-mana 3/3 that has a landfall ability that every time we play a land, it gets +2/+2 in any turn, so it can be a 5/5. We don't really have any other ways to get mana on the battlefield, so most of the time it's only going to be a 5/5. But still, 5/5 for 3 is definitely very good there. Worst case scenario, if you really need the green mana source, you can always play it as a green mana source on the battlefield tapped. Old Gold Troll is a great card, with it being a 3-mana 4/4 with trample, and then if it dies, the creature will return onto the battlefield as an or enchantment. Then it enchants a forest we control, and an enchanted forest has the ability to tap 2, and also 1 mana, tap it, sacrifice this land, create a 4/4 tap green troll creature token with trample, which is also very good. Combine that with something like Asika's Chariot, it allows us to make copies of that troll token, so that's awesome in that sense. And then Asika's Chariot, nonetheless, is another card that's very strong in green. It's a 4-mana 4/4 Chariot, legendary vehicle that we can crew for 4, and make it a creature. And then every time it enters the battlefield, we get 2 green cat creature tokens before I forget. And then every time it attacks, we get to create a token that's a copy of a target token we control. So we can target, the troll token, we can target the wolf token, we can target the cat tokens it makes, or we can target the tree folk tokens that Wrenn and 7 makes. And these creatures are power and toughness are equal to the number of lands we control. So the more lands we control, the bigger the tree folks. They also have reach, which also makes them very, very good. And they just get bigger and bigger the more lands we get. But nonetheless, the deck is pretty strong and powerful. And then, like I said, we get into Wrenn and 7, the last card in the deck. It's a 5-mana Planeswalker. Top +1, we get to look at top 4 cards of our library. We get to put all lands revealed this way into our hand, the rest into our graveyard. For 0 mana, we can put any number of lands from our hand onto the battlefield tapped. -3, we get a tree folk token creature with reach, and this creature's power and toughness equal to the number of lands we control. And -8, return all permanent cards from our graveyard to our hand. You get an emblem, you have no maximum hand size. Most of the times you're balancing the -3 and the +1, and then at some point you maybe hit the 0 if you have a bunch of lands in your hand. You just want to get them out at the same all at once, and making your tree folk token maybe that much more strong. But nonetheless, it's definitely a great card. Definitely a powerful card. Definitely helps finish off the games because sometimes your opponent doesn't have a way to deal with the tree folk token, and that thing can get pretty beefy pretty quickly. Mana base is pretty straightforward, with it being snow mana, 19 snow-covered forest, and 4 of the Faceless Havens. Another great card that synergizes very, very well in the deck just because it is a mana source that we can sink mana into and create another creature that is also free of vigilance, and we can use the mana after in the main phase 2 to possibly cast an additional spell. But a great deck. Second most popular currently in the format. I do think this one balances with the next deck I'm going to go over, being which one's the more prevalent when it comes to seeing more of it in the meta. But overall, great deck, very strong deck, wins a lot of games. If this is a deck you're looking to grind out the ladder, this is definitely a good deck to use for that process. And the last deck up on the list is MonoWhite Aggro. It's definitely a deck that I feel like a lot of people also kind of in a weird way a new mono red in a way. It's not as aggressive, but it is a deck that is kind of annoying, especially if you can't put up pressure against your opponent, as it is a very strong deck. It's just like the other decks on this list. A lot of these decks are pretty refined. Not many cards have changed. You may see cards that have additional copies of certain things or differences, but most of the time you're going to see a list pretty similar to this when it comes to mono white. It plays a lot of spells that will clean up the battlefield. It plays spells that will overwhelm your opponent, like Adeline here is a creature that is power and toughness is equal to the number of creatures we control, and then whenever we attack, it creates 1/1 human creature token that is tapped in and also attacking that creature. So it is a creature that produces creatures, gets even stronger that way, and it has vigilance, so it is something that your opponent has to kind of deal with, or it gets very big very, very quickly. This version is also using the card Welcome and Vampire as a 3-mana 2/3 flyer, that whenever one or more creatures with power 2 or less enter the battlefield under control, we get to draw a card, but the ability only triggers once each turn, so you can't draw a bajillion cards if you are able to play a bunch of creatures on a single turn. Yet again, keeping hand tempo and mono weight is very good, and getting a draw effect out of a card is pretty sweet as well. But in the 1-drop slot, we also have Hopeful Initiates, a 1-mana 1/2 with Train-In. Train-In is an ability that whenever this creature attacks, if another creature attacks with it with greater power, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. For 3 mana, we can also remove 2 +1/+1 counters among creatures we control, and we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment, which is definitely pretty sweet. We have other ways to put +1/+1 counters on our creatures, but having it built into the Train-In ability is pretty awesome as well. We have Ollenbach Escort. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with Vigilance. Sacrifice Ollenbach Escort. Target creature control with +1/+1 counter on it. Gains lifelink and indestructible in a turn. So it's kind of like one of those things. In case our opponent has some sort of board wipe or spot rule, we can always sacrifice this, giving that creature indestructible, allowing us to get in for that damage, or maybe block, or keep the creature on the battlefield if we play some sort of board wipe. Usher the Fallen, I think, is a deck that our card that you've seen most mono white decks, or decks that play some sort of white aggro. Just being a 1-mana 2/1 is strong in itself, and also with the boast ability, creating additional creature tokens is always very good for us, being aggressive against our opponent. In the true drop slot, we have Intrepid Adversary, a 2-mana 3/1 lifelinker that when it enters the battlefield, we get to pay 2 mana any number of times based on how much mana we have out. The deck's not going to have a bunch of mana out at any given time. We're not going to have like 20 mana out, but you can pay this additional once, twice, depending how much mana you have. It enters the battlefield with those many counters on it. And then creatures we control get +1/+1 for each Valor counter on Intrepid Adversary. So if it enters 1 counter, it's like kind of like a +1/+1 to our whole board. If it enters 2, it's a +2/+2, so on and so forth, the more mana you pay. And it's a 3-mana 3/1 is definitely good in itself. So definitely pretty awesome card nonetheless. Luminarch Aspirants are our other way of putting +1/+1 counters on our creatures. At the beginning of our combat, at every turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control. So just making any creature that we think our opponent has to figure out and deal with, much more threatening. So it's definitely a good card in itself. Sun Gold Sentinel is another great card. It's one of those things that eats things out of graveyards by exiling up to 1 target card in a graveyard every time it attacks or enters the battlefield. And then if we have Coven, which is if you have creatures of 3 different powers, so if we have a 3 power, a 2 power, and a 1 power, Coven, we can activate it. We can choose a color, and Sun Gold Sentinel gains hexproof from that color until end of turn. It can't be blocked by creatures of that color this turn, and activate it only if we control 3 creatures with different powers. So definitely a good card. It gets in for some free points of damage, so you can combine that with something like Luminarch Aspirant, and then we kind of have like unblockable if our opponent's playing some sort of mono deck. It's definitely good in that sense. Then we have Thalia, Guardian of Throbbing. It's a 2-mana 2/1 for a striker, and then makes all our non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. Most of what we're doing in this deck is all creature based, so it's not going to hurt us too much, but we do, I think, play a couple cards in the deck that aren't creature spells. Never mind, this version doesn't play that because we play Thalia, but it is going to make the decks that play non-creature spells that much more to pay them, so it kind of gives like non-creature spells an overall tax, allowing us to kind of delay maybe our opponent's like non-creature spell that may be a board wipe, creature spot removal, kind of those things, or maybe even mana ramp in that sense. So definitely a good card in itself, and First Strike is also pretty awesome. Then we have Brutal Cathar. It's a 3-mana 2/2 that enters the battlefield, enters the battlefield or transforms into Brutal Cathar. Exile target creature and opponent controls until this creature leaves the battlefield. And then it flips onto the other side. It becomes a werewolf. It has First Strike. The ward ability, they have to pay 3 life, and it's a 3/3. So every time it flips over, it's gonna eat something underneath, and then it's gonna continue staying out in the battlefield. It's a pretty sweet card. It's kind of like essentially like a Skyclave Apparition, but it is kind of like only creatures. So this kind of targets non-land permanents and non-token permanents that are mana value 4 or less, and this is kind of like just creature based, so it allows us to get rid of things that may be in the way if we can't attack into our opponent. Elite Spellbinder is another good card here that is definitely good to play on turn 3, as it is a 3-mana 3/1 flyer. Enters the battlefield, we have to look at target opponent's hand. We get to exile non-land card from it. As long as that card remains exiled, its owner may play it. This spell cast this way costs 2 more to cast, so it's kind of like a deck is kind of like gaining some tax on our opponent's things that they're trying to do, messing up their curve, or also maybe preventing them from playing their big thing to get kind of blow us out in that sense. Then we have Verdane, God of the Worthy. It's kind of an interesting card here, as there are snow decks out there that play snow mana, so it even it taxes our opponent's snow mana that enters the battlefield tapped. It's a flyer that's a 2/3 with Vigilance. Also, non-creature spells our opponents cast 4 mana or greater, cost 2 more to cast, which targets a lot of the board removals. Even Meathook Massacre actually targets. If your opponent has to tap Meathook Massacre for 4 or more, it's actually going to tax it even more, so they have to pay even more additional mana to do that. Worst case scenario as well, if we feel like we're playing a deck that actually is also pretty aggressive, we can play it for its flip side, which is Valkimra's Protective Shield. It's if a sorcerer opponent would deal damage to us, we prevent 1 of that damage, so it kind of reduces everything by 1. So even their creatures, if we can chump block creatures, their 1/1s essentially become ineffective. And then whenever you or another permanent you control becomes target a spell or ability opponent controls, that counter that spell unless they pay additional 1. So it's kind of like gives our us or non-land permanent we control ward of 1 So it's kind of like a tax as well. So the deck has kind of essentially turned into like a weird tax deck. So we have various ways to tax our opponent's things that they're trying to do, especially their expensive things. We kind of already went over Welcome Vampire. It's a 3 mana, 2/3 flyer. One or more creatures with 2 or less inches battlefield under control. We get to draw a card, and it only triggers once each turn. Adeline, it's a star 4 power and toughness, 3 mana creature with vigilance, and its power is based on the amount of creatures we control. And then whenever it attacks, we get to create a 1/1 creature in that process. So it's definitely a good way to get aggressive. And we don't actually have to attack with it. We can attack him with any other creature, and we'll still get a 1/1 out of it. Skyclave Apparition, kind of get rid of that pesky non-land permanent or creature that we have on the battlefield, and then if this does get removed or dies, they get a token equal to its converted mana cost. And then we have Legion Angel as kind of like the big topper card in the deck, a 4 mana 4/3 flyer. And it's just battlefield, we can reveal a card we own outside the game named Legion Angel and put into our hand, and our sideboard is playing just 3 copies of Legion Angel. We're not playing any other learn cards in the deck, so overall the deck is kind of focused on playing the cards that are within it. And then we have 19 of the plains, and we have 4 of the Faceless Havens, coming out to 23 total lands. But this is kind of the most current popular deck in MTG Arena in some iteration. This is one of the versions. It has a lot of the newer cards in it. There's versions that play none of the new cards, so depending on what you're doing, you're going to see some form or deck version of this mono white in the meta as a whole. But with that being said, guys, let me know in the comments below if you're playing any of these decks, if you're playing something different, or you don't really like any of these decks. Let me know which ones those are in the comments below. But if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.